Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX141 Walsh, welcoming you to an all new World of Warships gameplay today on our channel. In this episode I'll be setting sail in the Tier V American Battleship known as the New York, in a Tier V Domination game on the map New Dawn. The focus of today's gameplay is for us to provide an example of a match whereby you feel as though you have very little impact in the opening half of the match, and this can have a detrimental impact on your rewards or your involvement in the second half of the match. Whereby in the former case, in terms of rewards, you'll probably recall those games whereby you've been on a team which has pretty much steamrolled the enemy team, wiped them out in the opening stages, and you receive very little reward in terms of credits and experience because perhaps you're on the wrong flank, or alternatively weren't able to have the ability to do as much damage as the rest of your team, simply because you weren't in a favourable position to do so. And we now flip it on its head and talk about the enemy team steamrolling our own team. What we find is, if we're on the wrong side of the map to be able to try and stem the tide at the start, it means that in the end, if the game continues to go on, we are in a position whereby there's unfavourable odds and we're really having to try and mount a comeback against epic proportions. And that's what you're going to see here effectively, is that we're going to be forced into trying to mount a comeback because we wasted our opening opportunities and we're forced into a situation whereby we weren't able to have that opening impact that we would have liked. Now in terms of being forced into a position, I have to go to Alpha at the start of this game based on the following reasoning. The New York is a very slow battleship, a top speed of 21 knots. This means that in terms of getting to objectives, if we went towards Charlie from our spawn position, we would have been well behind our teammates going towards Charlie, and we can see a considerable number of our teammates are going that way. So logic would say they'll be able to take on Charlie, or at least draw the fleet at Charlie, in terms of reaching a stalemate against the enemy fleet that goes that way, and in return we'll go to Alpha to create a rear guard if the enemy team makes their way towards Alpha in considerable numbers. Bravo at the moment is out of the question, simply because there's two carriers in this game, they're both Bogues, and if they decide to focus us, despite our 73 damage per second on average AA, at the maximum range of 3.5 kilometers, we'll get ripped apart by their bombers. So in return, our hand is forced in going this way, and we start off by taking a look at the enemy Omaha and we'll try to do some damage at distance. And whilst we missed 9 of our 10 shells, the 10th armour piercing shell, 356mm in calibre, landed on the target and citadeled for 10,300 HP. And this is one of the interesting parts of the guns in the ship. You've got 5 turrets, twin guns in each, whereby the guns are not too accurate. At the maximum range of 20.9 kilometers, they have a dispersion of 269 meters, but when they do hit, they do considerable damage with armour piercing, less so of high explosive. Your high explosive maximum damage being 5,000 for reference, or a 30% fire chance. In opening fire on the Yubari here, you're going to see a hilarious outcome of the dispersion of these guns, whereby the outlier shell on the right of the grouping actually hit the bow of the Yubari under the water and picked up an over-penetration. And imagine if we provided just a tiny bit less lead, that could have been a citadel, unexpectedly. But enough for imagining what could have been. What's going on right now in terms of the minimap? Well, we'll note that the majority of the enemy team seems to be congregated still in spawn, trying to figure out which way it's going to go, although there are some leading elements making their way towards Alpha. In return, looking at our team, we can see that our team is having a bit of a kerfuffle as well, whereby a good number of our ships seem to be congregating towards Charlie at a slow rate, some are still thinking about going towards Bravo, and others have now turned back towards Alpha, and it's really not working out in terms of both fleets not knowing where they want to go. But the problem is now, we're going to be in a number of situations where the enemy team expose broadsides to us and we don't capitalise on them. And I'll take the blame for this. I'm not providing the right amount of lead in a lot of situations. We start with the Bretagne. By not providing enough lead, we picked up 4 over penetrations towards the bow rather than hitting the centerline and perhaps picking up 1 or 2 full penetrations or even a citadel. And this is going to be a recurring theme. But the problem is with the New York in particular, you have a very long reload of 34.3 seconds compared to the standard 30-second reload on the other battleships at your tier typically. And in return, when you miss, it means you've got to wait that little bit extra before you can open fire once again, and that gives your opponents more time to react, meaning that you need to make every salvo count. But again, we failed to do so here because we didn't compensate for the fact that the baton was turning, meaning that our shells miss, and those that do hit only pick up 1 over penetration and 1 bounce. And that's a lot of shell power wasted in 2 salvos. And this is only going to carry on as we continue to look towards the next viable target. In return, in terms of what's going on, And what we can see is that our friendly battalion is really heavily being focused by the enemy ships that are heading off towards the eastern side of Alpha. And whilst we do try to level the score against this Karlsruhe, we're still not getting results. Two over penetrations on the bow because we provided too much lead again. And that means whereas we could have perhaps knocked out one or two ships within the opening 5 minutes of this match, instead we've allowed a good number of enemy ships to live under the duress of our salvos, and we've only dealt 18,500 damage. In return, our team seem to be now congregating towards Alpha, retreating from Bravo and Charlie, and the elements that are in Charlie are now going to be outdone by a massive enemy ships making their way down towards Charlie. The enemy team's now starting to smell blood. Now, if you're wondering why I'm hesitating at this point to open fire, I noted that the Karlsruhe was turning away and I didn't want to waste the salvo again, so instead I decided to go for the Yubari, who seemed to be insistent on shooting at our battalion. But just as we opened fire, the Yubari starts to turn towards us and our entire salvo is going to miss. In return, we take a meaty amount of damage to our broadside from the battalion. And what this is worth pointing out is the fact that when we fire with all 5 guns, all 5 turrets and all 10 guns, we expose the full broadside to the ship due to the limited firing arc of that central turret. So ideally, if you want to angle, you'll only be using your ABXY turrets, either the 2 at the front and the 2 at the rear. The Yubari is pushing towards us at this point, and we would think at closer ranges, as the Yubari pushes in, we'd be able to punish them for their insolence and exposing another broadside. But that's a negative. 5 over penetrations, that's a nice amount of damage to a Yubari's health pool, but it's not enough to get them out of the game. It's not what we wanted. And now, just over 6 minutes in, we could have taken out at least 2 ships definitely at this point, and we haven't, and our team's now 2 ships down. It's really not looking positive, and this is echoing what we were talking about earlier as our team now goes 3 ships down. The fact that we're having a minimal impact at the start of the game. We're dealing damage, yes, but we're not able to knock ships out at the same rate as the enemy team is. And with the V170 now contesting our Izokazi, we need to help the Izokazi in this regard, because the V170 is going to win in the head-to-head, because unless the Izokazi gets the torpedo hit on the V170, they don't have the gunpowder to beat them. And even then, funny enough, when we think about it, the V170 can always do a bit of torpedo jousting, because they've got the bow-mounted or bow-angled torpedo launchers. The Izokazi doesn't. Now, we did pick up a nice 3,000 damage salvo there, but that V170 is still on a considerable amount of health, and our Izokazi is retreating towards Alpha. Now the thing is, if our Izokazi is still alive and we get rid of the V170, the Izokazi can now start to operate in open water without fear of being spotted, because they'll be able to see anything that's going towards them to spot them, and they can start to make their way around the objectives. The only thing they'd have to watch out for is the enemy planes. But until that V170 is gone, that's not going to be the case. We pick up another 2 over penetrations on the Yubari, unfortunately, and we're now turning around towards Alpha. And it's at this point that I'm starting to realise on a personal level, the only way we're going to get anything done is by closing the distance and taking the fight to the enemy team. Because this approach of sitting slightly in the back line and just constantly raining down fire is not working. I'm not used to firing the lead on these guns with a 792 meters per second muzzle velocity on the armour piercing, and I really need to close the distance to mitigate my inaccuracy as a player. So to do so, I'm going to be using the rather tight turn circle radius of the New York, the 600 meter turn circle radius, to come about and push in towards Alpha. We're not going to be very fast, but with our 12.5 second rudder shift, we'll dodge incoming torpedoes where we can and angle appropriately to take on the enemy fleet, as we pick up a citadel, a rather unexpected one, on the enemy Iron Duke all the way across the way, almost at 20 kilometers distance. Now pushing in, we see the V170 is charging in towards the point. I mark it out on the minimap for our Izokazi to react to. I'm hoping they do, and it looks as though our friendly bombers are trying to also go for the for the V170, at least our dive bombers, although they seem to have missed. And as we push in, we're going to try and use our armor piercing shells to wipe the V170 out of the game. But as we open fire at close range, the guns aren't too accurate. Only picking up 1 over penetration, that's just not enough. And while our Izokazi seemingly beached at this point, they're now a clean target for the V170 to rip apart with the superior gunpowder. And we haven't had the ability to capture Alpha, and it now looks as though, with our team being eliminated off of Charlie and the enemy team pushing into Bravo as well, taking out our last cruiser, our friendly Yubari, the enemy team can now take 2 capture points simultaneously and put our team at an extreme disadvantage as we absorb high explosive fire from the enemy Wyoming. Now in pursuing the V170, we're hoping to perhaps get a full damage penetration at this point, as they're exposing the length of their ship rather than their broadside, and we do so, 2060, and we continue to push in. But unfortunately, our friendly Izakazi is now caught between the torpedoes of the V-170 and the torpedo bombers of one of the enemy bogues, and that means that their time is up. And with that, we're now going to be in a situation whereby we've got no cruisers left and no destroyers left. It's only battleships and carriers on our team, and one of our carriers is about to fall victim to the enemy team at Charlie by the looks of things. So in return, we now have to spearhead the attack, and we're going to work on taking Alpha solo if possible. We tried to get rid of the V-170, although we can see we only pick up 1 over penetration there, but they're now on critical health. We only need 2 over penetrations to wipe them out, and we're just going to push into Alpha and push towards the landmass towards our front, because we're going to use that as cover to conceal us against the incoming fire of the enemy Wyoming and the enemy ships off towards the eastern side, whereby the landmass arcs accordingly, and we can use that to conceal our ship rather than our base detectability, whereby by sea it's 15.5 kilometers or by air 10.4 kilometers. We may be spotted by enemy aircraft, but they won't be able to confer an ample firing position for for the enemy ships. As we pick up a citadel there on the enemy Omaha once again, they must be feeling as though they're the #1 target of the year for our guns. Now, as we avoid the incoming fire from the enemy Omaha and turn underneath it effectively using that turn circle to our advantage, we push closer to the landmass we talked about earlier and we get ready to come to a halt. Well, no, not a complete halt, just around quarter speed if needs be, to dodge the incoming torpedoes as the V-170 sent a couple more. But the fact we're spotted at this point, we're already thinking that V-170 must be pushing towards us, so we get ready to react to it. As we see 2 sets of torpedoes coming in and we dodge them accordingly, the V-170 being off to our starboard side, and we get ready to finish them off. That's the enemy destroyer gone. Now we can start to turn things around, because they haven't got the ability to operate a ship under clear concealment and use torpedoes against us as effectively. The only torpedoes that will be threatened by now are those of the enemy torpedo bombers. We stand close to the landmass, so that way the Wyoming and the Omaha can't get shots on us. The Omaha's drifted too close to the landmass, or alternatively we're close enough to avoid the arcs of their shells. And we just come to a gradual slow nature as we come up towards the end of Alpha, making sure not to overextend beyond the landmass before the Wyoming opens fire, as they seem to be reacting to the torpedo bombers of our bogue, and we hit them accordingly with some armor-piercing shells, doing a nice amount of damage. We've also got the cap at this point, so we can now keep our team in the match. And we look towards the Omaha because we want to finish them off, angling towards the Wyoming effectively, so that way we avoid any potential damage from their incoming armor-piercing shells, if they decide to fire armor-piercing. Actually appears to be high explosive, which did 0 damage but knocked out one of our AA batteries and one of our secondaries. We don't mind that. And in looking towards the Omaha, let's try and get them out of the game. Well, a bit of a cheeky citadel there to pick up another kill. Now you'll note at this point, using our hill to compensate for the fire that's set on our ship, that we're going to be cutting our speed a little bit, because what we want to try and do is come around this corner that we're approaching slowly, turning our bow towards the expected position of the Wyoming in case they switch to armor piercing, at which point we can try and bounce the shells. Now it is worth noting we will be overmatched by the Wyoming's guns, because with our 19mm of bow armour, if we're hit directly on the bow, overmatch mechanics will say that guns of 272mm in calibre or higher will go straight through. But fortunately for us, the Wyoming fired high explosive and has set a second fire. We don't mind that, and we now expose our full broadside to rip them to pieces, taking them out of the game for another kill. Now we're not going to be putting out either of the fires because we've got a number of hills available. With hindsight, perhaps we should have put out the second fire because we are bleeding health at a considerable rate, but you'll note here how we're slowing down a little bit, so that way we let the fires start to burn out and we can get our hill ready to go once again, rather than wasting the fire extinguisher, in my opinion, at this point in time, in case the enemy bombers, particularly the torpedo bombers, decided to focus us and try and cause a flood, at which point we wouldn't have the fire extinguisher available to get rid of the flood, which would bleed more health from us. We look towards the enemy cargo, we get ready to open fire with all 10 guns, and here we go. And that's them out the game for kill number 4 and our Confederate. And you'll notice as we started closing the distance, we're having a more considerable impact. But the problem is we're now 14 minutes into the game, and it's only within, say, the last 4 minutes that we've really had the impact we've been looking for all game, and we're trying to turn this around. It has gone from a 5 versus 8 down to a 4 versus 5. However, we've got 3 battleships left and so have the enemy team, but they've got the carrier advantage. The only difficulty now is in trying to get our friendly battleships involved, who are well behind us at this point. Now they're making their way towards Objective Bravo, but is it going to be enough in time? As we take a shot at the Iron Duke. We pick up a nice salvo against the Iron Duke there, using the landmasses off to our port side to try and conceal our ship and make it harder for our opponents to shoot at us, and we start to use our turn circle to angle in against the armour piercing of the Koenig, who's opened fire, and it all bounces, or misses the target. And the Iron Duke seems to have overled us as they shoot beyond our ship, and it means we take no damage from that combined burst. And the one shell that does hit off the Iron Duke doesn't penetrate our armour, and we try to finish them off. Picking up our Kraken in the process. But it's at this point that we now enter a situation whereby, despite the impact we've been having, we now are in a situation where we can't have as great an impact as we'd like, because we're now in a situation of unfavourable odds, as articulated earlier, whereby we're up against a Koenig and a Wyoming. Now the enemy Wyoming, off to our left hand side, loves to use high explosive, and they'll be using that to set fires. The Koenig, on the other hand, who's fired their armour piercing salvo off towards our friendly Bogue, is trying to get our Bogue out of the game and will then focus us. Add to that the enemy Bogue now sending torpedo bombers in, and you'll find I actually make a key mistake here, which is I react more to the torpedo bombers rather than to the enemy battleships lying ahead of us. Whereby I'm thinking those torpedo bombers are coming in on my broadside now, instead they've actually been angled to come round to the other side of my ship, i.e. the starboard side, not the port side. And in return, with the lack of AA I've got at this point, having lost a number of AA guns to high explosive damage earlier, I take some considerable damage from the enemy battleships over time, and one of those torpedoes is going to hit from the bombers. Now fortunately, whilst I am going to take the torpedo on the aft of my ship and therefore have a flooding set, I do have the fire extinguisher available. But in return, without a fire extinguisher available, that Wyoming can now set fires and continue to do damage, and having exposed my aft to the Koenig's armour piercing, what we'll find is 19mm of aft armour means direct hits with armour piercing on our aft are going to overmatch the armour and do considerable damage. In return, we do throw some armour piercing back at the Wyoming, but it's not going to be enough to get them out of the game. As we pick up an 11,000 damage salvo there, and we try to get a couple more salvos in before they finish us off. Fortunately, their high explosive doesn't set a fire there, but our health's not looking too favourable. As the Koenig throws in another salvo towards us and we bounce a good chunk of it, and we fire off our 3 other main turrets, but we take an armour piercing penetration there towards our rear, and despite getting a citadel on the Wyoming, it's just not enough to get them out of the game, which means their next salvo is going to be the finisher. Or at least that's what we're expecting. We'll just have to see. And so our journey in this match comes to its end. And without keeping the match going for another 2.5 minutes, unfortunately our friendly battleships can't turn this game around. They just don't have the time to do so, and due to their positioning, they're not able to get to either the enemy carriers or alternatively get close enough to be able to go toe-to-toe to the enemy battleships and take them out of the game as quickly as possible. Therefore, we're going to skip the rest of the game and proceed to the post-game stats. So unfortunately, despite the promising signs of a comeback, it was eventually a defeat for our team. Nonetheless, we can see our battle performance amounted to 154,240 HP of damage, and with that we picked up 4 achievements. The first, the standard achievement of Devastating Strike, for destroying an enemy ship with a single artillery salvo, torpedo salvo or aircraft by causing damage to over 50% of the destroyed ship's normal health pool. This was dealt to the first of the 2 enemy Wyomings. We also picked up 3 heroic achievements. Number 1, the Confederate, for damage at least 6 enemy ships, whereby the damage caused to each of these ships must exceed 20% of their normal health pool. We picked up the High Caliber, for damage at least 4 enemy ships, damage caused must exceed 30% of the total health pool of all the ships in the enemy team. And finally, we picked up the Kraken Unleashed, the one that everybody wants, for destroying 5 or more enemy ships in a single battle. Coming on to the team scores, we can see that despite losing, we topped both teams in terms of base experience earned, picking up 1,636. The difficulty with this is the fact I personally feel I could have had a much bigger impact at the opening stages of the game if I'd simply provided the appropriate lead for my salvos on the enemy cruisers that continue to expose their broadsides and indeed the occasional battleship. But instead, by not providing the appropriate lead, we were punished for our inaccuracy and for the extensive 34.3 second reload on the New York's guns, meaning that over time the damage we could have dealt was lost to the seas, and therefore the enemy team was able to get an advantage which our team could never come back from, despite our efforts in the second half. This also goes to highlight as a result how, despite being very powerful in a single ship, this is a team game and not a game of 1 versus 12. Coming on to our detailed report, we have 2 key items to note here. The first is the number of enemy ships we hit, a total of 9 out of 12. But if you take away the fact that the enemy team had 2 carriers like our own team, and therefore those carriers would have been sat in the back of the map as much as possible in the game, you could say 9 out of 10. Highlighting the fact that we did not focus on particular enemy ships, and where possible we tried to exploit every opportunity conferred to us, particularly as we started to push forward into Alpha and push towards the enemy team in the latter stages. The other item is in the damaged modules category, whereby 22 of our modules were damaged, 20 of those being anti-aircraft guns. This would serve to highlight why we struggled to bring down those enemy torpedo bombers that overflew us right at the end of our life, whereby the lack of AA guns available would have had very little output in trying to bring those planes down, while centrifuge damage per second at 3.5 kilometers being minimised to a massive extent. And finally, coming on to our credits and experience earned, we can see that after additions and deductions, we walked to our 347,101 silver credits and 2,454 commander experience. To conclude, hopefully today we have demonstrated how as an individual ship in a given match, lacking the overall impact in the opening half of the match can have a detrimental effect to your team's ability to turn around unfavourable odds as you go into the second half of the match. Whereby in today's example, we saw a lack of exploitation of the opportunities conferred to our 356mm caliber cannon in the opening half of the match when foes exposed broadside to us, whereby as a player we didn't provide enough lead on the target, meant that we failed to capitalise on knocking key enemy ships out of the game, enabling us to push into Alpha at a rapid rate and turn things around with the assistance of our teammates, making it a much closer game and meaning we wouldn't have to have tried to pull off a very big comeback towards the end of the match. Therefore, we could say that the enemy team were in a favourable position from the outset, and as time went on, this position only became stronger and stronger, meaning that despite our efforts, there in the end, there was no way back, and the enemy team's success was pretty much guaranteed. And so I've been TX141, and if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future World of Warships videos on my channel. And as always, if you're looking to get into World of Warships today, feel free to do so by using the link in the description of this video. Remember, it's free of charge to sign up, and I'm sure you enjoy this game just as much as I do. But until next time, take care and fair seas.